you were to ask me to use just one word to describe the MG ZS, I think the word I would use would be surprise. Now before I do anything else, make sure you subscribe, make sure you click so you get notifications, and make sure you comment, like, share, all of the normal YouTube things, and visit newmotoring.com. The MG ZS is MG's third current new model. They've also got the MG3 and they've got the MG GS. The MG GS was their first SUV and it's the bigger SUV, whereas the ZS is slightly smaller. Now, why did I open by saying that the word that I think of when I think of the ZS is surprise? Well, it's not because it doesn't have its flaws, because it absolutely does have its flaws. But I think before I explain anything else, I need to say the price. This car costs £12,495. £12,495. A basic Fiesta is £13,700. A Nissan Juke is £15,100. Well, that gives this car some perspective. It is very, very, very cheap for an SUV. It's cheap full stop. The engine in this car is a 1.5 litre naturally aspirated 4-cylinder petrol engine. It's got 105 brake horsepower and 104 pounds-feet of torque. It'll do 0 to 62 miles an hour in 10.9 seconds, crack 109 miles an hour flat out, and it'll get about 49 mpg. The engine is a bit rough. It doesn't make a particularly good noise. I'll put my foot down now. Second gear, 3,000 RPM, 30 miles an hour. 40, 45, 50, 55. We're near the rev limiter at 6,000 RPM, but we were only doing 55 miles an hour. Pace is something it doesn't really have, but it just doesn't have any low down torque. You put your foot down, like you saw there, in second gear, and you want to get going, and you're just left waiting. To make the most out of this engine, you really need to rev it to pieces. Peak torque is 4,500 RPM, peak power is 6,000 RPM. That's not particularly helpful in an SUV, let's be honest. It's one of those cars where if you come up behind someone and they aren't driving quickly enough and you want to overtake them, you can't really do it unless you've got a bit of momentum behind you. However, this might actually be the engine to go for. There is another engine you can get in the ZS. It's a 1 litre 3-cylinder turbocharged engine, and it's got a tiny bit more power and it's got a little bit more torque, but it's slower and less economical. That doesn't really make sense. You buy turbocharged 3-cylinder engines because they're better, surely. I'm not entirely convinced that one would be. The gearbox is a 5-speed manual gearbox, and if you get the 1 litre 3-cylinder turbocharged engine, it's a 6-speed double clutch. It's very light, but it's actually quite nice to use. The only trouble is, when you're doing 70 miles an hour on a motorway, it sits at 3,000 RPM. It would be better with a 6-speed manual because the revs would be lower, your economy would be better, it would be quieter. I'd rather it had a 6-speed manual. As nice as it is to use, actually, and that really did surprise me, I think it would be better with 6 speeds rather than 5. The suspension is comfortable, actually, which is probably exactly what you're looking for if you're buying a cheap SUV. But the flip side of that, obviously, is that there is quite a lot of roll. I mean, yeah, it certainly rolls. And the steering, well, like the gearbox, it's very light. And being light isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I can't really feel anything. I can't really feel what the tyres or the wheels are actually doing, which is frustrating. Although, if you think the steering is too light or too heavy, you can make it lighter or heavier. There are 3 modes on the 2 top-level trims, and you can have an urban mode, a normal mode, and a dynamic mode, and it just increases the steering weight depending on the mode. To be honest, it's best just left in normal. Dynamic feels even more artificial, and urban is, yeah, you shouldn't really be using it out on the open road. If you're parking, fine, fair enough, but if you're not, don't use it. As for the design, outside, do you know what? I quite like it. Some smaller SUVs, some of this car's rivals, to be honest, look a bit of a mess. Some of them are absolutely shocking to look at. This, I think, is actually quite pretty. And with more models, the more models that MG produces, they are kind of developing their own look. Inside, it's not bad either. I'm not a fan of the fake carbon fibre effect look, trim, on the dash. I think car companies generally don't need to do fake carbon fibre, do something else. But the materials generally are way better than in the MG3. The MG3 is the oldest new car that they currently make, and granted it's about to have a facelift, but still, when I think back to driving the MG3 and now sitting inside this, they are worlds apart in terms of quality and design. You can adjust the steering wheel's height, but you can't adjust for reach, and that is frustrating. But the infotainment system, honestly, is really, really good. The pedals are well placed, even if they are a bit light. And everything else in here is just simple and logical. It's well laid out. And as for the steering wheel not being able to come any closer towards me, well, for me, that isn't really an issue, because as many of you probably would have noticed, for every video I do, there is at least one person who says that I am short, that I am, well, in my parents' car, that I'm Harry Potter, that I'm someone who's just very, very small. And because of that, obviously, I drive super close to the steering wheel, so it doesn't really matter for me. All in all, it's comfortable, the gearbox is nice to use, but dynamically it does have its issues, there's no getting around that, like the steering feel and the pedal weight. But when you remember what you're paying and you remember what you're getting, if you're buying a cheap SUV and you're looking at one of these, chances are you can probably forgive some of its flaws.